Welcome to Edge of Reality TV. I'm Lynn Nickerson, your host today, and our other host, Willie Hassel, he's going to be working behind the cameras, filming here at America's Stonehenge. So, briefly, America's Stonehenge is one of the quintessential mysteries in North America. It's been determined that the site of stone structures is approximately 4,000 years old, or more, and it's unquestionably an astronomical calendar. But the question still remains, who exactly is responsible for having built this area? There have been many theories out there, and it was once thought that perhaps the Native Americans took part in this, but it was a product of the Native American culture, which in part is true because they did live in this area for a while. But others have also surmised that maybe the colonial farmers were clearing their fields and built some of these structures. I kind of think highly unlikely, but that was one of the theories out there. Another one is it's believed that some of the Irish Culdy monks built this area. And then there's a suspicion, based on evidence now, which we'll discuss a little bit later, that perhaps the settlers from the Bronze Age from across the Atlantic settled here, such as the Celtiberians, immigrating here from the Mediterranean area. So, this is all something we're going to discuss today. Seated with me here is Mr. Dennis Stone, and he's the proprietor and president and chairman of the board of directors for American Stonehenge. Dennis and his family own and operate this area, so along with his wife Pat, his son Kelsey, his daughter-in-law Catherine, they're pretty much responsible for the operations going on here. And Dennis, of course, has about 35 years in the aviation industry, and he's recently retired, and he has studied astronomy, he's studied archaeology, and he's even done some hands-on archaeological digs here at the site. So Dennis, welcome. We're so glad to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me on today, and welcome to America's Stonehenge.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being here. We were so excited to come here and film on site rather than doing it out of the studio, you know. So, let's talk a little bit about what goes on here. We can get into the layout in just a minute and then into the history, but this place is not just for adults who are interested in history. This is like a family affair, and you have programs here geared toward children. So could you tell us about that a little bit?
Yeah, we have, during the summer months, we have a kids' gemstone dig down near our visitor center.
Oh.
And the kids can come in there and they can play archaeologist, ages I think from 2 to 12. And they can dig up little gemstones, and usually when you get them into the dig pit, they don't want to get out. So it's a lot of fun for them. It's a little bit educational. And we have a nature trail, and we have the alpacas, and the kids love the alpacas.
Oh yeah, they love animals.
Yeah, they're so cool,
Yeah.
yeah. They're part of the family of the camel family. And most people, like I, grew up thinking they were from South America, which they are, but they actually originated in North America.
Yeah, I read that. I couldn't believe that.
45 million years their ancestors were here. So that's kind of a little bit it's kind of fun, and you learn something at the same time.
That's super. I didn't realize that you had gemstones here on the property.
We
What kind of things did they find?
Yeah, also, actually, there are real artifacts found on the site, like quartz crystal and the different type of minerals like feldspar, micas, and it's basically granite. But and there are some other types of stone that have been found here, rhyolite and felsite, stuff like that. I think those were imported to the hill. But the kids get the chance to dig up all sorts of these really beautifully polished stones and everything, and they have a great time with that. And those are the things we actually put in the dig pit for them to find.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, a little magical trick there, but the kids enjoy that. They really do.
So they are any of these considered semi-precious stones?
To the person, yes. They're not gold or silver, but semi-precious, I guess. Yeah. To the kids, they're very precious.
Okay, well, it's pretty much generally known that this whole site consists of a lot of different stone structures. So rather than getting into the geological history of it, perhaps you could touch on when this was discovered, like in recent memory, like in the 1800s, and then who owned the property and kind of what each group of people did to it, or what they found.
Yeah. So up to 1730, in that era, 1734, a gentleman named Seth Patty bought a piece of this property, and at that time, this was part of Haverhill, Massachusetts.
Oh.
Part of the Haverhill Peak, and the Haverhill proprietors controlled the land. So he bought a piece of the land, which we don't think included this site, but it did include a piece of this hill. And about 10 years later, he bought another piece of land, which we think included this site, in 1744. In 1741, a couple of years before that, the state of New Hampshire, Massachusetts finally settled on the boundary on the southeast corner, and we became New Hampshire in 1741 in this part of the state.
Oh.
And downtown Salem was part of Methuen, Mass, until that time. So in 1750, the town of Salem was incorporated, and after that, they started building houses, and that's when we think the first house probably went on this hilltop. The Patties really didn't know what they had. They were shoemakers, 5 generations of shoemakers, actually.
Where did they work out of then? Out of Salem?
Yeah, they did. There was a shop set up down in Salem, and I'm trying to think exactly where it was. It's in the history book, though. There's a...
Were they on the Merrimack River?
They were in the Merrimack. Actually, one of the earlier Patties, he was not only a shoemaker, but he had a ferry across the Merrimack River.
Oh,
I think that was Richard Patty. It was Peter, Richard, Seth, Jonathan, Seth, and George.
Okay.
And then it goes out of their hands in 1863. And then towards the end of the 1800s, it does go back into the Patty family again. I don't know why they did that, but they sold it, it came back. And we have a picture in 1890 with the Patties down on Haverhill Road, which is our main street in front of a house. We think that is the house that actually was on this hilltop and brought down there. So the Patties have kind of a lot to do with the site, and possibly damage too.
I was going to ask you about that. Now, they built their house on one of the stone structures around the corner here, didn't they?
That's correct, yeah.
How large a house was that, do you think, initially?
Pretty standard house. I think at that time about 20 feet wide, 40 feet long approximately, 2 stories high. And it was a wooden house that sat on a foundation.
I mean, it was a stone chamber type foundation, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, yeah. We think originally it was a courtyard modified into a cellar hole, basically.
Okay, so part of it didn't even have a cellar hole, right? They just used the stone chamber.
They used what was there, kind of, yeah. They modified it, though, and about 1855, the house was damaged by fire. And after that is when we think they moved it down to the Haverhill Road location, and it's still standing here today.
At that point, did they have any wild idea what sort of a historical significance this place had?
Not that we know of. There's no written testimony or anything like that by the Patty family saying, "Oh, we got a weird place up here," which
a
people
bit
did.
Different.
Later they did. People did later, not the Patty family, but they did have quarrymen up here, and the quarrymen were up here to take stones away from the place for other local building projects.
To use these stones that are already available.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And Jonathan, the gentleman we talk a lot about, Jonathan, he was here, and Jonathan he had 2 sons. People often say Jonathan had 6 husky sons, but he actually had 4 daughters and 2 sons. One son died about 16 years old. I believe he was in Boston at the time. He did have 4 daughters, and we have the names of all the children. And he was a tax collector. He was an abolitionist with the Underground Railway. And he took in the town paupers from about 1830 to 1836. Then he gets into the Underground Railway. And again, he was a tax collector in the early 1800s. And he knew that if you didn't quarry the stones yourselves, there was no tax to be paid. But if he had quarried these stones instead of the original, maybe the ancient people, he'd have to pay a tax on the quarrying process, I guess.
So he started selling off the stones?
I think, yeah, that's what that's our best guess right now, is he's the one that some people thought his father or maybe his son, but we think it was possibly Jonathan that did that.
And so they actually did find at least one manacle in the cellar hole, didn't they?
Right, yeah.
Do you suppose that that was something that they had removed from someone? I almost think so.
Yeah. It sounds like it, yeah.
Okay, well, after the Paddies left, there was a Mr. William Goodwin that moved in here. Now, was he an archaeologist exactly?
Probably an antiquarian, somebody that was really interested in the past.
Okay.
Did a lot of reading, well-read. He was from Hartford, Connecticut. And he was independently wealthy. Yeah.
But what did Mr. Goodwin think about the location? What was his theory on what it might be? He certainly didn't think the colonists built it, did he?
Not at all, no. He had been kind of involved with where Leif Erikson landed. He was interested in where Columbus landed on his first voyage.
He kind of thought that he went up the Piscataqua River in Portsmouth, didn't he?
He thought that might be Vinland, or maybe this place was Vinland, but he thought the port of Portsmouth was where the Vikings came into, you know?
Yeah.
But Goodwin, when he saw the site, was amazed by it. He felt maybe it was Viking. But as he uncovered it and as he had a crew working for him, he said, nope.
Thinks it predates it.
It predates it.
Yeah.
It's not sod houses, it's stone structures.
Yeah.
Not the same as a Viking settlement, yeah.
So the Great Island section of that book, what was that in reference to? That wasn't Newcastle, was it?
No, Great Ireland would be, the Irish monks coming over, that theory. And this was Great Ireland. This is an escape from the Vikings, and he felt that they were trying to seek refuge from the Vikings who were blitzkrieging Europe, including Ireland, you know. And this was going to be a safe place for them to worship.
Yeah. Well, then let's talk about exactly physically what someone would find if they came to visit, when your visitors do come. Let's talk a little bit about the layout, like the stone structures, the different types there are, and then the astronomical calendar. So coming up here, I know that we run into a couple of, how many stone chambers are there?
Yeah, on the main site where we're at right now, the main site, there's about 30 main features. There's probably about a dozen structures remaining today. But there's all sorts of other little features too, you know.
Well, there are. There's like the really old drain system.
I was just thinking of that. Yeah.
The draining
there's
system.
About 15, 12 drains. Some of them go up to 75 feet to keep the place dry.
And that had to have been established when the place was being built. It had to have been because it goes through the bedrock, right?
Right. It wasn't an afterthought. It was when they planned to
build the site. It was deliberate.
I think it was all deliberate. Yeah.
As well as a well. There are 2 wells here, correct?
Yep. 2 wells.
And I mean, they're old wells.
That's what it appears to be. Yeah. And those wells are kind of interesting. We don't have an exact idea why they built them, but they don't seem to be something the Paddy family used. One remains dry unless it rains or snow melts.
Yeah.
And it has actually the last 3 feet of it was solid bedrock somebody had quarried through, and there was a vein of quartz crystal found in it.
Oh.
Which is kind of cool. Quartz crystal, not just quartz, pretty cool. The lower well, we've never excavated that to the bottom because there's a water table. It always fills it up. So we basically got to drain it and pump it out and clean it. Then we might have a better idea how old that is. Is it historic or prehistoric, you know?
Well, there was a theory that perhaps the Native Americans built this, and I can see how they might have been confused because down by the wet well, there is like a little pond area, and it's full of clay, and they did find that there had been habitation there by Native Americans. I'm not sure if they found pots down there, but some of that was carbon dated, correct?
Right, yeah.
And the Native Americans would have used the site for making pots, particularly with the clay, so that they could have traded it, because apparently there was a lot of clay there. So it could be that they kind of repurposed this area because it was already here, you know, and there's quite a bit to use.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
So I can see where someone with a shorter, more short-sighted historically might have thought, well, perhaps it's the Native Americans and the colonists kind of added to it. But we're coming to find out that it's not, because this whole ceremonial section, there's really 2 sections. The center ceremonial section, which is about an acre, is surrounded by an astronomical calendar, which encompasses about, you said, 15 acres.
Right, yeah.
So we know that there are 2, a primary and a secondary set of alignments that are marked out. The stones mark cardinal directions and different points on the calendar and different seasons, and positions of the moon and positions of the sun both. So, which is something that Stonehenge also does.
Right. Yeah.
So it's very closely patterned after Stonehenge. So do you know if it is directly patterned after Stonehenge? Are there all the same components? Or is this more intricate?
Yeah, I think this has the star alignments too. And Stonehenge has the lunar and the solar, as you mentioned. And this one has star alignments with a true North Star. And Stonehenge does orientate itself north, south, east, west, and they may have had, this alignment with a true north. But I don't see that usually mentioned in the. I just read what was his name? Gerald Hopkins' book from 1965. Again, just as a review. It's an old book, 5 decades old, but he thought Stonehenge was a computer, and he goes into all pretty good. He's an astronomer.
That's
but yeah, you don't
interesting.
see too much with the star mentioned. We do have, we think, according to the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in 1977, they looked at our data from our survey. In 78, we get the results back. I think you could do this computation on your cell phone now with the apps and the power of our cell phones, but 40 years ago, we sent it, at this time, 40 years ago, and we had to wait months for it. And we got it back, and they said that you have, if these alignments worked for astronomical purposes, they would work about 1800 BC plus or minus about 2 centuries, which agrees with our oldest carbon dating, by the way, a different way of dating.
200,000 BC.
Yeah, about 2000 BC.
2000 BC, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2000
But
BC.
you also have not only lunar and solar alignments, but you have the true north alignment with a star Polaris today, 4,000 years ago, was a star called Thuban. But you have 23 other star alignments, and we were amazed. We didn't know that, but their computer showed that. So even 4 decades later, we haven't really identified all these other 23 star alignments. So Stonehenge has both solar and lunar, but we may have possibly 24 star alignments at the site.
Really?
With star rising on the horizon,
And
helical,
stars,
yeah, and then
stars setting.
and setting possibly too. Yes.
So of the first primary set of alignments, there are the cardinal points of directions, which is north, south, east, and west. And then there are the spring and autumn equinox, sunrise, and sunset. So that's 4 additional points, so that's 8. Then the summer and winter solstice sunrises are accounted for. And then February 1st, which is considered February 1st sunset, which is a season or a period called embolic.
Yeah. Yeah.
We haven't quite, embolic is supposed to mean fire, but we're not quite sure of the significance of that just yet. But then you do have the North Stone, and it is aligned to, it's not aligned to Polaris now, but it was
pretty close to it.
Is it?
Close to it, yeah.
But it was set up for Alpha Draconis, which they called Turbine.
Thuban. Thuban, yeah. That's the way I've heard it pronounced.
Okay.
But, I've heard stars called different things when I listen to TV or radio, and I'm like, I would have pronounced it differently.
Yeah,
Thuban's the one we've used,
Thuban.
Alpha Draconis.
Gotta
It's not even
remember
the
that.
brightest star in Draco the Dragon, but it's that's a mistake,
Well,
4,000 years ago would have been aligned with that star,
Well, they were thinking about closer to 1800 BC for the age, but then they were looking at the North Stone and what the North Star was that was prevalent during that period of time, and come to find out there really wasn't a North Star between 1700 BC and 1450 AD.
About the time of Columbus, yeah.
So there was not a star that was parallel and on the horizon for the North Star during that period of time. But preceding that, between 3700 BC and 1700 BC, there was Alpha Draconis. So that's why they're kind of pushing it even further back. So in accordance with the carbon-14 dating testing, they've determined that 2000 or 2200 BC is approximately the age of the site.
That's correct, yeah. Those
I think
different
that's
methods.
amazing.
Yeah, yeah. So the Great Pyramid of Cheops would have been set up, and Thuban would have been the pole star too.
Yeah.
Yes, at that time, yeah.
And then there are the secondary alignments, and you were talking about that, which one of them would be May Day, the Beltane, and then August 1st, Lammas?
Yeah,
Or is that
I've heard Lammas, Loch Ness. I've heard different pronunciation of and call different things. Yeah.
Okay, and they even they record sunrise and sunset for all 3 of these events, May 1st, August 1st, Lammas, and then November 1st, which is Samhain or Samhain. And then, additionally, summer and winter solstice sunsets. And then the north and the south major lunar standstills when the moon appears not to be moving. So That's pretty intricate astrology for 2200 BC.
Yeah, probably not a coincidence. Maybe
Yeah.
one stone aligned with another stone aligned with a summer solstice could be a coincidence, but when you have all of the different ones we mentioned.
So, in addition to this, which I find absolutely fascinating, I mean, this is so exacting to begin with, you've got the North Stone, the North Star, tracking the other way around. It is the North Stone tracking the North Star, which is not a constant in the night sky, and that's due to the Earth's warble. So the axial precession of the Earth is like a 26,000 year cycle, and the curvature on the North Stone traces this in the sky for the 26,000 year cycle. So they were aware of the length of the cycle and the fact that the Earth was warbling.
It seems like they did. I know every 72 years that word numbered 72. Some cultures think it's sacred, but that's 1 degree of change because of the precession. So every 72 years is 1 degree of change of that. And ancient people passing this on from generation to generation would see a slow change. These things would become out of line with the star or whatever they're watching, and they're like, it's not aligned anymore. And there are some sites in the world where you can see, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which they were there for 11,600 years before present. And they actually turned some of the stones over time to keep the alignment going. You can see the actual movement on the floor. You can see the scratch marks. You can see where it stood and where they moved them.
No kidding.
Yeah, so generationally, people said, it's not in line. We're going to have to adjust these 50-ton stones, and they moved them. Here, they set up other markers that kind of follow Duban later in time. It seems,
Yeah.
They may have done that. It would have been a generational thing. They might have scratched their head and said, why? What's happening up there? But it used to be when our great-great-great ancestors looked, it was over this stone, but now it doesn't quite, it's out of alignment with it. And they may have marked them with 2 more, and then eventually later 2 more stones outside of that. That's what we kind of discovered in the 1970s during the survey of the site.
It's astounding because it's over such a long period of time, and for them to be aware of that.
Yeah, it is. This site could have been under many generations of use, possibly. So many, many years.
So, how do you feel about the spot as far as what its origins might have been?
You mentioned the Native Americans, so we know they were here. They've been in New Hampshire for over 10,000 years, and we have a 7,500-year-old fire pit up near the North Stone. It doesn't really date the site.
7,500 years old?
Yeah, plus or minus a couple hundred years, and that was found about 1995. The President of New Hampshire Archaeological Society did a shovel test pit study, and actually we're kind of still conducting that, and she's still with us after she began here in '89. 3 years on the North Stone doing an excavation, and she began this, what we call an STP study, shovel test pit. And one of the finds was what appears to be a fire pit, and they sent that material to either Geochrome Laboratories or to Woods Hole Oceanographic. We used both both places for radiocarbon dating. So that's a middle archaic time period, about it was 7,400 years plus or minus a couple hundred years. So we know Native Americans were here probably on this hill as early as that. So that's not a question. We have Native American pottery. You mentioned that too. But it does have an old world look to it. After seeing many sites in Europe, and there are 50,000 of them in Western Europe, I've seen similarities between like one of our structures we call a V-hut and what we call wedge tombs in Europe. Our east-west chamber looks like gallery graves I've seen in France. They're also in Holland.
You have been to France?
Yeah, I've been to France a couple times, and up in the northwest corner. But these megalithic sites, I mean, they're all over the place. Spain, Portugal, Ireland, England, Scandinavia has them too.
But even similar to this, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and even one of the chambers we call the south-facing chamber, it's off to my right as we sit here, kind of in front of you. It has lilacs on it today, and that chamber looks like even Mr. Goodwin's took a picture from County Meath, Ireland, and they're called fugu. It's a style of structure, and there are many of them over there, I guess. A fugu. Don't ask me to spell it, but some people felt they were used for sweat houses for ceremonial purposes.
Really?
So I had a gentleman here from England. He's been on History Channel a lot. He was here about a year and a half ago, and we had a tour. And I asked him during the tour, I said, are you familiar with fugus? And he goes, oh yes. He goes, over in Ireland. And he goes, they do come in a variety of shapes and sizes. I said, does this look like any of the ones you see? He goes, oh yes. This looks like a couple of the fugus over there. Because again, they vary a little bit in size and shape.
Yeah.
But he goes, it looks like this. So there are many different structures on the site that do have kind of an old world look. And megalithic sites are in Russia. I have a picture on my phone of one structure in the Ural Mountains. There are many of them. I show it to people that are researchers on this, that are familiar with this.
Yeah.
And I said, what do you think this structure is? And they go, well, either, well, it might be one in Vermont or down in Connecticut. And I show them it, and it's actually in the Ural Mountains of Russia. It's an ancient site over there. It looks like one of ours. China has them, India has them, and Korea had over 100,000 megalithic sites.
So are you saying, other than just the commonality of it being a megalithic site, does it look like the same cultural patterns?
Well, the size, the shape, the orientation of these structures, and again, the orientation too. If you have
It's usually
these,
astronomical.
yeah, the astronomical, and even our V hut, it faces southwest. The ones in Ireland, they face southwest. So these type of stone structures, if you look at a snapshot of our site and a snapshot of ones overseas, they're in Africa too, and South America has them.
Yeah, yeah.
Australia, even I found out last fall, has them. So they're on 6 out of 7 continents. The question comes up: is it just a independent inventions, so they look similar by coincidence, or were the people crossing the oceans and diffusions going on with ideas, exchange of cultural, different things culturally? That's been an argument going on for a long time. Did these people have the ability to travel over the ocean? Could they have done it? Would they have done it? We have found at the mouth of the Merrimack about 7 years ago, and it wasn't myself, but it was in the papers. They found a Phoenician coin came out of a construction site.
I didn't hear that.
And and off the coast of Florida, they have found Phoenician, what appears to be Phoenician anchors. And from Maine all the way down to Brazil, they have found Phoenician writing. And Dr. Barry Fell from Harvard, he died in 1994. Really gets criticism, but he does bring these things to the forefront, puts them in people's faces. And then
The man spoke, 17 languages? He spoke a heck of a lot.
He was intelligent. He was very, very intelligent, well-read, very, very, he did a lot of research, a lot of study over the years, and he was at Harvard for about 20 years. And he was from New Zealand originally. He got educated in England, so he was familiar, over there, with the ancient sites. And then, but he was an invertebrate marine zoologist, and but his passion equally was
epigraphy.
These ancient sites, and how did. And he was looking at basically with his profession, how did animals and different things travel around the oceans. Then you get into how man may have done this. The same thing with currents,
with the
wind
currents,
ocean currents.
Yeah.
So he wrote 3 books: America BC, Saga America, and Bronze Age America. And he had a group of about 1,100 people called the Epigraphic Society. And the Western Epigraphic Society division of that is still functioning today, even though he's been gone for about 23 years. So he found inscriptions. He actually didn't find the inscriptions here, but he looked at our inscriptions that have been found over the years.
So what types? There were 3 types that were found here.
Yeah. So one of them he identified as Iberian Punic, which is Phoenician, found in Iberia, Spain, and Portugal because of the style of the writing. It was a little different than some of the other Phoenician cities, like maybe Carthage, or Lebanon or whatever, because the Phoenicians were out of the Phoenician coast of the Syria, Jordan, Israel, Golden Heights. But he also found in this site and identified it Celtic Ogham, and the third one was Libyan. He said Spain and Portugal. Libyan too. Right across the Mediterranean from Spain and Portugal. Libya is on the other side in Africa. And Spain was a melting pot, he said. Many cultures came through there.
Yeah.
And so they were multilingual, and he felt that when they came over to the Americas, they came out of that area, Spain and Portugal, and they brought with them, they were able to speak, multiple languages. They were also able to write in Phoenician, Libyan, and Celt, was his feeling, from the evidence. And these writings are found all the way out to the Milk River in Alberta, Canada. They're found again up from Maine all the way down to Brazil,
Okay, so going back, how far here in North America? At what point do you think there was this infiltration?
I think this site dates to about 2000 BC. It's a little bit early when you look at the Phoenicians. When did they come into existence? A little bit early.
Yeah.
So somebody was coming over from that area. And later he said that he thinks there was a second migration around 800 BC, and that's when these inscriptions were coming over. So it might have been an earlier Old World, they're talking about people going back to the last glacial era coming over now from France, Spain,
I know.
Portugal.
They keep pushing it back farther and farther.
Yep, DNA and all of that seeming to prove that. But he felt it came out of the Mediterranean, the Iberian Peninsula area into the New World, and not just North America, but as I mentioned, South America and Central America has evidence too. It's just so much of it, you know.
Well, they were also migrating then through France and then into the UK, weren't they?
They were, yeah.
And
yeah,
they did that before they went across the ocean, didn't they?
Yeah, possibly. I've been reading a lot about that in a brand new book. It was written a number of years ago. Excellent book of how, and even things like Egyptian influence way up in England. They found some jet beads from Egypt up in
really
around Stonehenge area, and some other artifacts too, and some pottery influence, you know, and bronze, copper, then Bronze Age influence coming in from the continent into England. But some of it came out of the Mediterranean, like Egypt, you know. It's like, wow, that's kind of interesting.
Do you know that the Micmac people, they had their own system of writing. They used hieroglyphs that were in place when the French people came over. Did you know that?
I think Barry Feld, I mentioned
yes,
that.
in his book,
Yep.
yes.
Yeah, isn't that cool?
Yes, and that there
Yeah.
was a serious Egyptian influence in their writing.
Yeah, yeah. That's
So
how
that's
do you
amazing.
explain that? I mean, some people might say that's just coincidental.
Well,
but how do you
he
explain
shows
that?
it column for column and
know.
glyph for glyph how similar they are.
And on that same talk, he found a lot of place names all over New England: mountains, rivers, valleys, and gorges. Portageechee Gorge.
The names, yes.
Both sides of the ocean.
Yes.
And not only the name, but the meaning behind the name. Like Algonquin, Merrimack River has a certain meaning. Amoskeag, Portageechee Gorge, Lake Memphremagog.
Yep.
But in Gaelic or Celtic, it had the same word with the same meaning. And maybe one or two could be coincidental, but list upon list, as you mentioned, list, he found the same thing with
It's
the place names. Yeah.
way beyond coincidental.
Yeah, where does coincidence stop, you know? And
yeah,
shows that
you
people
have to start
weren't...
looking at the facts.
Yeah.
I did want to mention this is America, BC, that there's a lot of information here about those coming over from Europe and Mediterranean, and Mystery Hill is also in here if people want more information. America, BC by Barry Fell. And we've also got New England Ancient Mysteries, which was written by Robert Cahill. He mentions Mystery Hill. They all have little pieces of the puzzle. And then, of course, America's Stonehenge, written by the Mystery Hill story by David Gurgewad.
Yeah, it's Godsworth, but
Godsworth.
only because I know him.
And your dad, Robert E. Stone, so
Right, yep.
Godsworth.
Godsworth, David
Okay.
Godsworth.
Treasure of information in here. You might be interested in doing some reading on that
And
for
we're doing
further
a new book pretty
information.
soon, too.
What was that?
We're doing a new book, so...
You are?
Yeah,
you
that
and your
book-
son?
Yeah, that's my daughter-in-law and myself. We're writing it, and because my dad's book is excellent with David Godsworth, but it's about 15 years old, and we have so many new updates. We found all sorts of new stuff that my dad had passed away in '09, and we found in the last 2 years. He died almost 8 years ago. We found some amazing things up here. You know.
Oh yeah, you got to publish that.
Yeah, we got to put that together. Yeah, I found some cool things like measurement systems. We found some serpentine walls shaped like serpents up here, and windows and walls and all sorts of stuff. All in the last 18 months. So our tour guide map is out of date. That book has some really good stuff. You could add a chapter to it, but I think we're going to just do a whole new book, you know.
Okay.
And my diorama, when you come into our visitor center, it's like I did it in college 40 years ago. That definitely needs a nice update because it's almost in the Stone Age now. A little.
It's very good. It's very helpful.
Okay.
Okay, so Dennis, you were talking about that you're putting this book out. Do you have a title for it yet?
I don't have a working title.
A working
I had
title?
a couple ideas, and we haven't done too much with it in the last month.
Okay.
But basically, we wrote the script, and I did kind of we filmed it, and then my daughter-in-law, Kat, she ended up doing transcribing that.
Okay.
And so now, we're kind of laying out the book chapter by chapter.
Okay,
And we're
so
gonna
it's
do
a lot of
something-
updated information on existing stuff, which
Yeah.
is really important.
Yeah, because so much has been found just in the last 2 years, for sure, you know.
Oh, wonderful.
And I retired. I think that was part of it. I spent more time here, which was, I love flying, but I was on the road about 100 hours a week. Now I just seem to be finding things here. And coincidentally, like down in Connecticut, they're finding things, and out in Colorado, very similar kind of,
Really?
yeah, kind of structures, cairns, serpentine walls. It seemed to be coming up by different people all of a sudden in the last 2 years. I'm like, it's pretty amazing, actually, you know.
Sometimes it makes you wonder if it's sort of a consciousness rising that,
It might
that
be.
plays into that.
I don't know how to explain it, but it seems like, wow.
So maybe next time we come back, we can talk a little bit more about the book. We can talk about some of the unique items that have been found. For instance, we talked about the eye stone. We talked about there's a carving of an ibex and there's a carving of an arrowhead, and well, various other things. So maybe we can hone in on what group that evidence supports who might have been the builders.
Yep,
All right?
exactly.
We'll
Yep.
take that up in the second half of the show.
Looking forward to it.
So thank you very much, Dennis.
Yeah.
And we'll be right back. Well, welcome back to Edge of Reality TV. I'm Lynn Nickerson, your host, and working behind the camera today is your other host, Mr. Willie Hassel, and he's the one who's making this all happen today. So right now we are seated here just about at the center of the ceremonial center of the astrological calendar here at America's Stonehenge. And seated with me is Mr. Dennis Stone, and he's the owner, the president, and chairman of America's Stonehenge, Inc. So welcome back, Dennis. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you again, Lynn. Thank you for having me on.
Well, this is a real treat for us to come here and film this historical site, so we really appreciate it too. So we left off in the first half discussing the history of the owners, what they did to the site individually, and then the fact that this is an accurate astronomical center that offers both lunar, stellar, and solar alignments. So what I wanted to do is to get into the points of interest that might indicate potential origins of those who built the site. So we kind of determined from carbon-14 testing that the site was back about 4,000 years. So that would make it about 2000 BC. So several of the points of interest I'm going to begin with. Well, we were sort of discussing the sacrificial stone, so I thought maybe we'd take off from there. Now, there's a lot of controversy about the stone and whose it was, whether they were sacrificing animals, people, or maybe if they were just making lye soap. So I think we've kind of ruled out the lye soap. But animal or human, I wanted to ask you, there have been people here looking for traces of blood to substantiate what it was. Did anybody ever come with some luminol to test it?
Not to my recollection, nobody has ever done that, although we've thought about that, you know. But if you have like 4,000 years between its use and present, it may be weathered away possibly. It wouldn't even show up.
It could be, but if it were confirmed, then
Yeah.
at least you'd know that there was some sort of sacrifice most likely going on. But whether it's
Yeah.
animal or human is another story.
Yeah.
But I was
yeah.
curious to know if that had ever showed
That'd
up.
be great. Actually, we'd probably be open to doing that. You know, we
Yeah.
part of the science, part of the research of the site, the study of it for sure. Yeah, we tried not to conceal anything whatsoever. You know,
Yeah.
the other possibility is protein analysis. They can actually get into a little micro crack in an arrowhead, axe head, or even maybe the table. And I often wondered if there's any other type of technology, and I think it's fairly recent. They can get in and they can get out. If there's a very small fissure in the rock, if there was blood in it, for instance, they can actually extract that, and they can go back about 10,000 years and tell whether it's animal.
Are you serious?
It's pretty neat, and they can tell you whether it's human, animal, and what type of animal, and what time period. You know.
Is that really expensive?
I don't know. That's one thing I don't know is the cost. I'm sure it's not cheap. Nothing seems to be cheap when you're doing testing.
Yeah, I know.
But so there is a
human or
possibility. There's a possibility of doing that, you know. And,
that would
but you
be-
have to get the right part of the table with the right crack, and hopefully, you know, you can find material in there and then send it off to a laboratory. So it's possible, you
That's
know.
an exciting possibility.
Possibility, yeah, yeah.
Another thing that kind of substantiates just a little bit, there's certainly a similarity, is in your book, which is actually the book that was written by Mr. Goudsworth.
He's been called, different, but I think it's Goodsword.
All
I always
right.
mispronounce.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, it's Dave Goudsworth. I have to say both names.
Dave Goudsworth, and your father, Robert Stone.
That's it.
And it's titled America's Stonehenge, The Mystery Hill Story. Now, in there are a couple of pictures. One we'll talk about later, but the first one I wanted to point out was in Shrewsbury, Mass. There was a stone found with an etching on it, and it was clearly delineated, almost a trapezoidal stone with a runnel around it as if fluid could run off, and then what was depicted as a human being spread eagle. So it could have been that, maybe the human was lying that way so that the midsection could be dissected, cut, sacrificed, or whatever, which it looked very much like this one here behind us. So not that that's definitive evidence, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, we've been aware of that stone since the 1960s. It was found
Really?
earlier than that. So I think a farmer overturned it. And by the way, that is in Mount Mineral, and
Mount
shoots
Mineral.
yeah, about 75 miles from here. And my dad visited that. I think I did back in the 60s when I was a kid. But there are some stone structures associated with it. Apparently, it was laying with the carving face down. It was turned over, from my best understanding of it, and what I read about it. And this, I guess it's a carving in relief, or a raised carving, or anaglyph we call it. And like you said, it looks like our table, the same shape, the bell shape, with a person, kind of spread eagle. It does seem to have some sort of like a little collar thing around the neck.
Oh, I didn't notice.
It's kind of, it's something you have to kind of look at. And it's, oh, there it is, you can see it. By the front left leg, there seems to be kind of a circle. And if a person was laying on our table with their back on the table, the front left leg would be by that little runnel that goes off, and below that on the bedrock, there is a cutout in the bedrock where like a vase could sit. It almost looks like maybe somebody saw something going on our table, and they went back there and they created this. They didn't have a camera, so this is what they created. In 1964, my dad founded a group called New England Antiquities Research Association, and that particular carving became the logo of NERA, and it still is today, 53 years later. So every time you look at the NERA website, you will see that that carving, basically.
All right, well, that carving, does that necessarily predate or post-date what's here, or is there any way of telling?
I don't know if they can do any particular testing. There is a thing called optically stimulated luminescence, but it has to be an undisturbed, and obviously the stone's been moved from its original position. There may be some other ways of dating it. I believe there's different ways of telling by moss and lichens on stone how long something's been there. But if somebody saw a sacrifice or some sort of a ceremony on the table, obviously the table was here, and then they did this after they viewed it. Yeah, later on, I guess. Yeah,
but that isn't definitive, is it? Which,
it's an opinion, I guess. But when you look at it, it's like, if it's a coincidence with a table shaped like ours, because it's got the same shape.
There's a correlation.
Yeah, I think there's something going on with that. And there are chambers down there similar to our structures too, and about 75 miles away. Yeah.
The chances are that they're very similar, and they're indicating the same thing and the same procedure.
Yeah.
Well, now that you mentioned chambers, that was another issue I wanted to bring up, the stone chambers. And we don't know the origins of this site. One of the interesting things about the oracle chamber, well, this is several things, but I want to point out that the ceiling in that is corbelled, and it's very similar to what is found in Ireland, in Donegal, Ireland. So there's a connection there, a European connection. You would mention that. And the other issue about the oracle chamber, the Phoenicians, of course, took from the Greeks. They borrowed from the Greeks, and of course there was the oracle at Delphi. Very much the same thing. They would have a seer that would prognosticate future events, and that appears to be what this is all about here. So there seems to be a connection there with the Phoenicians and the Greeks. You agree?
Well, we have a sort of a Wizard of Oz going on there, and the oracle tube that goes through from the oracle chamber to the underneath the sacrificial table is about 6 feet long, and kind of a square-shaped opening. And when Goodwin first dug the site, the table was buried to the very top with earth, and both ends of that tube were plugged with stone, as though somebody concealed it.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. Why would they do that?
Yeah, well, apparently there is the theory that the site was abandoned quickly. Do you have any idea why that was? And they covered up their tracks, seemingly.
We thought of that years ago, because not only was that particular tube plugged up, but they also had some stones inside the drains, kind of keeping the drains plugged so stuff wouldn't wash into them and cause clogging or whatever.
Yeah.
And it looked like they closed the place down and then they abandoned it and never came back. And the other thing we found out more recently, we may have discussed this on the, that there's a lot of quarried stones all over the hilltop, big slabs of stone that were once part of the bedrock that somebody separated from the bedrock and they propped up with other stones artificially. And when we found a few more in the last couple years, we were quite amazed. We probably have almost 3 dozen of these. They had a bigger project, we think, on the site in the future, and they walked away from it like a work in progress. It's like, so that makes kind of a big question. What happened to these people? Why did they leave it,
The other thing too, the sacrificial stone, the slab that it's made from, it appears to have been taken from over here in the plaza area, which is considered the center, which is considered a sacred area, so that they gave this sacrificial stone some significance, having taken the stone from that section.
There are stones from the plaza area, and they're some of the biggest roof slabs, very significant. However, the table actually came from right in front of us, underneath more significantly, underneath the astronomical viewing center. There were 2 cairns there, and when Mr. Goodwin, unfortunately, at the end of the 1930s, we have a big tripod of wood with a hoist, taking it apart, rebuilding part of the wall of the ramp. He thought that there were beehive chambers connected to the oracle chamber, but there actually were solid cairns, and he destroyed them, and 40 years later we realized that he destroyed the astronomical center. So
but this is part of the center, though, isn't it?
It is the astronomical center, and that's where the table came from. So that would have been something important, as you were getting to, even though it was in a different spot than you said. It's very important. And that table, you can see where the cutout is today. There's no drill marks, no metal tool marks in the stone where the table came from. And then they dragged it about 40, 45 feet to where it presently is today.
Who knows, maybe they raised it, with their powers.
Yeah.
It's interesting how they move some of those large stones.
They're pretty heavy stones. That one weighs almost 9,000 pounds. Yeah.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, then getting on to, perhaps I want to bring up the stone walls. The stone walls are kind of an enigma because a lot of people have thought that maybe the colonists were clearing their fields and they were building these walls. But clearly there are some characteristics of these walls that Native Americans didn't incorporate into their stuff, nor did the farmers. And one of them is that a lot of the walls in part of this section are curvilinear, that they're not straight, that they swerve, they're serpentine, and that the beginning of some of these walls have like a triangular stone that sort of replicates the head of a snake, that the motion of the walls appear to be like slithering like a snake, and that there are standing stones placed at intervals on the back of this quote snake to make it look like an undulating motion. So there appears to be premeditated thought into the construction and the design of some of these stones. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, we noted years ago that these walls looked a little unusual because they contained a lot of flat stones in them, and these walls run thousands of feet all over the hilltop, and we know the area wasn't an area for growing crops. It's all bedrock, very thin soil level, and the rock walls do sit on the bedrock, and then very small amount of earth is actually accumulated over thousands of years, from wind-blown soil and vegetation decay. And these walls will be like a wall, then a wall beyond that, and a wall beyond that, and a wall. Farmers don't need that kind of thing, but farmers did build walls for boundaries, field clearings, and stock fences.
Usually right angles, too.
In right angles, yeah, exactly.
At the same level.
In a big area they might contain for keeping an animal in or out of an area. And these areas here, they're just wall after wall after wall, and they just don't make sense.
They don't make any sense.
No, but we have found that the astronomical alignment stones are in the walls. That was something we discovered in the 1960s, the big monoliths. And more recently, we found that the walls seem to go from a glacial deposit, erratic or deposit stone, over to another glacial stone, and then it will take a turn, go over to another glacial stone. It's like you're connecting all these big stones like a rosary bead kind of thing, But some of them are shaped like serpents. They'll just run 30 feet with a head, a tail, and sometimes they have a vertical slab, which was part of the bedrock at one time stood on end, and we call it a spine stone. And then we have some that are straight, some are rectilinear, and some are curvilinear, as you mentioned. And they do appear to be like others found throughout New England, including a place in Connecticut where there's about 400, and they run from 30 to 300 feet there. Ours run from about 30 feet, the smallest, up to about a half a mile. There's one that goes from the watch house, completely encircles the entire top of the hill, and it contains I believe every one of our astronomical alignments are contained within that wall, and it does undulate like this, and it does curve like this, and it has a big head, which is actually the watch house. And just in front of the watch house, the tail comes right back by what you can consider the head of the snake, and it does one more up and down, and then it does a 90-degree turn. It's like almost like the serpent's biting its tail, but it's about 0.56 of a mile around. We measured it this summer. We walked the whole thing, and we videotaped a lot of it. So,
what do you think the significance of the snake motif is?
The serpent is everywhere. It's in the Bible, with Adam and Eve. You mentioned Delphi before, and Python. I had been there in '85, but I had forgot the story. Python was killed by Apollo, and they had the Pythian Games, and so they had the Oracle there too. So the serpent was very important, and then they worshipped Python after that. And then they had these kind of like Olympic Games every 4 years after, which is part of between Olympia and Delphi. I think that's where modern day Olympics kind of come from.
So that's the Phoenician Greek.
The Phoenicians had the serpent, yeah, and then even in Central and South America, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, Viracocha, they're all like bearded serpents. The Chinese, the Japanese. It seems to be a worldwide phenomenon, so it's a little hard to pinpoint a culture.
Yep.
But you could say that the Phoenicians and some of the people that were in the megalithic sites, going back to Göbekli Tepe, 11,600 years. Some of the artwork at Göbekli Tepe is serpent. Some of it's lion, and some of it looks like a fox, which might represent a comet. I think they're looking at the constellations, bringing some of that as above down to the earth, as they above so below. You're bringing Draco, the constellation, down to earth, that serpent constellation.
Yeah, the idea of some of these motifs that are so ancient that they're ubiquitous across the world. Like another thing would be pyramids. Pyramids are found everywhere across the earth. So why not an effigy or a replication of the serpent? The idea of the serpent. I find
the Egyptians
very
for the cobra, sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Quartz stones. Now that's another really important point I wanted to bring up, because they have been found here. They have been found in megalithic structures across New England, and even in Europe, of course, especially in Ireland, Scotland, and whatnot. Now, James Whittle, who was an amateur archaeologist, and he worked on some digs here. In your book, the one in Stonehenge that I just mentioned, America's Stonehenge, he was holding two rocks. They were both not quite square, but they were almost more diamond-shaped. One was from Gungy Wamp in Groton, Connecticut, and the other one was from Donegal, Ireland. You've got some of those here too, and he was drawing a connection between what has been found at this site and then elsewhere. And there seems to be something undeniable that there was some kind of significance given to the quartz stones. And you've got a cairn here. It almost looks like a pile of stones, and it's almost in the shape of a boat. Oftentimes the quartz stones are found on top of that, or inside chambers, or within the walls. But I know that in the watch house, you've got one of those quartz stones there. Has any significance been given to that you know of? Do you have any idea what the significance is?
The one in the watch house particular?
Sure.
Yeah, well, that one there, we kind of noticed it recently, because it was just one of those. I mean, yeah, it's funny, these, you can walk by something a million times and not really pay, even the serpent walls, for instance. But that rock right there is similar to the one at like the Newport Tower, where on a particular astronomical event, say like a winter solstice or something like that. That one there, during the winter solstice, the sun will be pretty close to illuminating the interior of that. And like in Groton, Connecticut, there's another illumination effect where the sunlight...
I've seen a picture of that.
Isn't that cool? It's really cool.
The beam of light going right
Absolutely.
to it.
And they photographed it, so I mean, you can see it. And it's pretty amazing. It's pretty awesome to watch that. The same as at the Newport Tower in Rhode Island. It's kind of an egg shape, and it's the sun is the male, the female would be the earth. And it's the sun rays penetrating, going to this, fertilizing the egg kind of thing. So a lot of fertility going on.
It's a tower now? Really?
Yeah, that's pretty awesome to see that one too, because it's shaped like an egg. Actually, it's in a wall. And the winter solstice, it's actually illuminating it. It's sort of like a fertility kind of thing going on there. That's what it appears to be. Chaco Canyon, out west in New Mexico, that has an illumination effect too. And that particular sun dagger chamber, actually the sunlight illuminates a carving, a petroglyph.
Do you feel that that's fertility related or
It
not?
could be, yeah. It seems like it is.
definitive, though.
I think so. Yeah, it seems to be in because you have Newgrange in Ireland, where you have the illumination in there too. And
That's right.
And I've been to that site in 1983 with my dad. That's an amazing site. So they have it over there, and that's just one of the many that have that
Yeah.
illumination. With astronomical alignments for the sun, for instance, you'll have either illumination or shadow effect, or you'll have the sun setting or rising over a particular stone. So there's like type 1 astronomical alignments and type 2, or A and B as some people call it. A might be the illumination shadow, and B would be just actually watching the sun set or rise over a particular point, or the moon doing it, and some cases the stars, So that one there, what we have to do is knock down about 1,000 feet worth of trees to see that, and unfortunately that land beyond that is our neighbors, and we can't cut the trees,
can't cut the
only
trees.
down about maybe about 100 feet. So I was down there last winter looking at the possibility of opening that up, and it looks pretty difficult because the trees, it just totally, even with the leaves gone, it's a thick forest there on our neighbor's property, and I don't know how. Maybe we can simulate that somehow. There's a computer, some sort of computer thing.
Yeah.
Maybe we can recreate it.
There's another idea that might be attached to this, and of course nothing is definitive, so we're speculating here. But I did a little bit of research on the quartz stones. I went to Mary and Jane Gage's site, and of course they've done a lot of research on megalithic structures in New England in particular. He does the photography and she does the research. And there is the indication there that, I don't know if they've gotten this from the Native Americans, because they kind of think that the Native Americans were instrumental in building some of these structures, which I don't think is necessarily true. They might have contributed, but I don't think they were the original. But anyway, she makes the connection that Native Americans, or that whoever built the stone walls, used the quartz stones as some kind of way to ward off evil spirits. What do you think about that?
We do have quartz and quartz crystals here, so we have both. And my dad started noting that back in the 60s, looking at cairns around New England, and at the site too, finding quartz seems to be kind of on a lot of these chambers, either on top of a cairn, in a wall,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
And that's true of European sites too, a lot of European sites. And you think of Newgrange, the whole front of it's been rebuilt, but it's got a facade of just quartz. It's beautiful,
so it's very deliberate, but
It's-
maybe in the walls, you might have the illumination significance, but maybe in the walls too, they want to protect the boundaries. So therefore they put those stones in the walls.
Yeah.
And then as far as in the chambers, who knows about the illumination, but again, we have to figure out what the use of the chambers were.
Yeah,
Maybe it was
yeah.
illumination and protection. Who knows? Something
Exactly.
to consider.
Yeah, probably something to do with, warding off evil spirits or a positive energy or some sort of an energy
She
type
was
of
sort of
thing.
indicating that,
Yeah, but they seem to be preoccupied with quartz and quartz crystals
They
in many
are, aren't
places.
they?
So I guess we have to try to figure out what they were thinking,
Yeah,
and
what
we're
they're-
not too sure yet.
How
But
to crawl inside their heads and figure that out.
Exactly, yeah.
As far as the structures or the significance of the stone chambers, we were talking about the oracle chamber, and there are other stone chambers here. Do you suppose that some of them might have been used to store goods or relics, relic artifacts, ritual artifacts, or perhaps some of the larger ones to store corpses?
Suppose a couple of chambers here are quite small, but and I can think of one over in the plaza area, but it faces the sunrise towards the equinox in the east.
Okay.
And it might have been where you put an offering in it. And we have a couple of them, and they basically the whole site is orientated true north, south, east, and west, with the exception of the V-hub, which faces southwest. There's another little structure in the wall about 600 feet west of us, and with the astronomical wall, it looks just like that other little structure, and it faces east also, but just behind the plaza area we have a little bit of a structure, and Goodwin unfortunately he messed with it a little bit trying to restore it, so we're not sure if it's original shape, but it looks like it's a sunset. But if you're going to store something, probably make something out of wood, a wooden structure. It'd be much easier to do, unless it's a religious relic or something like that, and I think that's what the site was, a religious site. And so you might be kind of right. Some of these could have been where they placed we have 5 closets in the oracle chamber, 5 stone closets.
So those are probably used for storage of some sort.
Something that was special, something, that's a lot of work, to build something like that,
But I've heard one of our friends here, Sandy, she also thinks that maybe some of these larger ones might have been used as tombs, or what I'm thinking is maybe after the rituals, maybe there was a place needed to store some of these bodies until something was done with them. It's just a thought.
It's possible, you know, the east-west chamber looks like the galley graves over, and they're in Holland, and they have a Dutch name I can't pronounce, so in northwestern Ireland, which I have not visited that part of Ireland, and they're also in France, which I did get to see a couple in France, and they always run true east and west, 20 to 60 feet, and they were used as tombs of some type. And the V-hut looks like some of the wedge tombs of Ireland. When Mr. Goodwin cleaned out these structures, he took out the dirt and debris. Today they would actually send it to a laboratory, have it tested. The chemical analysis might reveal that it was a tomb because of certain trace elements like calcium. So unfortunately, 80 years ago, that information was lost. But, there may be some way in the future with some new technologies, even though that's gone. Somebody may be able to do some scrapings off the, who knows, you know, technology
Here, or
is
maybe
amazing,
elsewhere,
you know. Or
like,
elsewhere,
you know, like parallel sites.
Something untouched, you know.
Yes, exactly. We're running a little short here on time, so I did want to bring up at least one other important, well, two important issues. One would be the H stone that you've got on your little map that you hand out. It is called the lunar stone or the eye stone.
Oh, okay.
And because there is a picture of an eye on it, and at first I thought perhaps it was a bird. So I decided to do a little research and see. They use animal motifs. Could this perhaps be a bird? But the eye of Horus, according to Egyptian mythology or legend, represented the sun, the right eye did, and the left eye represented the moon. And that stone does mark a lunar alignment. I thought that was pretty interesting. So, you know, whoever thinks it's an eye, I think they're right on.
Yeah, is that a coincidence? I mean, it's kind of another coincidence. We have a lot of coincidences here, some people feel, you know.
Yeah,
but that's really interesting, yeah. And Barry Fell found a couple more of those, I think, in Vermont, so that's not the only one.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, there's several other ones, too.
Well, that
so
would
it's not
reinforce the idea.
Yeah.
Okay, then speaking of Barry Fell, your dad and Barry Fell, well, your dad found a stone with inscription, and Barry Fell took a look at it, and he found that the script on it was Celtic Iberian or Iberian Punic. So he determined that perhaps Phoenicians or the Iberian Celts came here, and that would kind of bring us to arriving around 1200 BC, or maybe, you know, about 1000 BC. Do you think that correlates?
Something like that. Barry felt sometime maybe around 800 BC, possibly, maybe a little bit earlier, as you mentioned, because of the style of the Phoenician writing, which you call Iberian Punic, Iberian being Spain and Portugal.
That predated, though, didn't it, the Iberian Celts?
What he felt, from my understanding in talking to him, reading his books, he wrote several books and all that published, was that he felt that Spain and Portugal was a melting pot, and people from Libya were there, people from the Celts came in there, and the Phoenicians were in there, and so it was like a melting pot, and people were multilingual, and he felt that maybe rather than separate arrivals to the New World, and it's possible he did that, he felt they were coming over, and these people were multilingual. That's one of the things we saw here in 1975 when he first visited us, and then he spent the next 19 years before he passed away working on all of this around all over the Americas. But we met him and talked to him very much about that. But he thought that Spain and Portugal, these people could speak a couple different languages. And the time period would be about a little over 1,000 years before, I should say, after the site was first built, from the earliest datings we have. So it may have been a later wave of people coming in, and it does seem like the site was changed. We think we had an earlier astronomical center, and then the one we mentioned a little while ago where the sacrificial table came from may have been a later one. And we're finding some other stonework up here that seems to indicate one use, and then it looks like it was modified into a different use. It's a little hard to explain, but we were on this in 1970s when I had an uncle work here, and he said the same thing back 40 years ago. I think some things went on in stages here by different generations of people. So the site could have been used for quite a while, and sometime a little after maybe 1000 BC, the Phoenician, the Iberian people came in, the Phoenician, Libyan, Celtic, the inscriptions came in at that time with these people. And they're found all the way from Maine down to Brazil, these Phoenician writings, and all the way out to Alberta, the Milk River in Alberta, Canada, you know.
But also Ogham was found, which is Irish pretty much.
Yeah,
and
that's the
that would have been
Celtic
a later migration of people coming, right?
Possibly, I suppose, yeah, the Celtic Ogham, yeah. And we found some of that writing down in the Paddy area back after Barry Felt visited us. He kind of clued us into what to look for,
Yeah.
and our eyes are wide open, and one day when the sun was just right, it reflected off a stone, and we found this stone that was actually, it was myself and another gentleman, it was in Paddy's wall, so he must have just picked it up when they built the wall back in the 1800s, and it turns out it looks like it was a Celtic sun symbol.
So we can say that probably the Phoenicians came, probably the Celtiberians, and probably some Irish monks, but what we don't know, which is a real big question mark, is who came around 4,000 years ago
Right.
and built the place.
We don't
That
have
is
a name
still
yet. Yeah.
open to
Yeah.
conjecture, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. I'm feeling it's probably Western European because of the similarities of the stonework, the time period's correct, but we don't have a name of a culture, you know.
Okay.
Exactly. So that's part of the mystery, and these sites are all over the Northeast. This is
Yep.
the biggest complex, so.
So that's where we're going to leave it. It's still a big question mark, which is all the more reason to come to this site and inspect it for yourself. And I would suggest reading some books, the book that Bob Stone wrote, and even Bob Cahill, and anything America BC by Barry Felt. They all give a little bit of insight as to what took place here about 4,000 years ago at this interesting historical spot. Thank you for joining us, Dennis.
So thank you, Lynn, for having me as a guest. Thank
Really
you very
enjoyed
much.
it. Thank you.